Welcome. Today we're going to discuss poetry and ambient music. Poetry and ambient music. Introduction. Ambient music is a genre of music that emphasizes tone and atmosphere over more traditional song structures and other rhythmic constraints of other genres. It has many subgenres including ritual ambient, dark ambient, frost ambient, light ambient, drone, IDM, and more. It is often wordless or lyricless, which makes it one of the better genres to listen to while we cultivate a writing practice. I find it particularly good to listen to when I'm writing because if I were to put a different type of music on, maybe hip-hop or punk music, I'm going to be hyper-distracted either by lyrics or by the kind of clashing energy of punk music, and that's not going to be very helpful to write poetry because if too many words are coming in to my mind, it's going to be hard to think and allow words to come back out. So other music, a lot of the experience can feel like received from. In ambient music, it feels more like you're becoming part of. In a hyper-distracted world, one in which we're constantly having our attentions pulled from one place to another, how can things like ambient music and poetry help deepen our listening, our attention spans, our contemplation, and in what way are these two similar, despite in the many ways that they're different, one being made up almost exclusively of words and language, and one being made up of musical rhythmic sounds. Part 1. What is ambient music? British composer, musical theorist, and ambient music producer Brian Eno had this to say about ambient music. Ambient music must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention, without enforcing one in particular. It must be as ignorable as it is interesting. End quote. When using ambient music in the poetry writing process, its ability to be ignorable and interesting at the same time can create for interesting trance-like, dreamlike headspaces where it's easier to access the words necessary to capture an experience in poetic language. It can create an effective response where creativity can be streamlined and pulled out of us and pushed onto a page. Perhaps this is similar to ephraxis, in this case meaning when a poet takes a piece of art and responds to it by writing a poem. While the poet is listening to the ambient music, a response can occur which can come out as a poem. And in that sense, even though there's a poet writing the poem, it's being co-created by the atmosphere generated by the ambient music as well. So in some respects, there's a collaborative approach happening if we listen to music at the same time that we're writing. However, in the same way that it's almost impossible to answer, though we can answer it for lifetimes and generations, the question, what is poetry? Ambient music has a similar elusiveness to it. One way that we could think about describing poetry is by what it isn't. We could say poetry is writing that is not prose. But then what about prose poetry? There's the hybridization of poetry and prose happening. So that definition doesn't quite work. Or we could say poetry is characterized by line breaks and stanzas, which is true unless it isn't. Or we could say that poetry is predominantly or exclusively made up of words, which we can say kind of, but then what about concrete poetry where sometimes shape of the poem is what takes precedence over the meaning over words? Or perhaps there's one word and it's bent into so many other shapes. It's visualizing language. And that's a type of poetry too. So ambient music has a similar type of elusiveness. You could say that it doesn't have any lyrics until you find an ambient track that does. Or you could say ambient music doesn't have a drum beat, which often can be true, but then you can look at some of Aphex Twin's work where there's drums littered throughout. Much ambient music utilizes predominantly electronic textures and sounds, but then you can have ambient artists like Enmata in his album The Hermit uses a lot of organic violin music that runs throughout the album. Some ambient musicians use field recordings as well, where you go outside into the world and press record on a tape recorder or a Tascam, as I have somewhere, and record organic sounds around you and place them into the music. An example of this can be found in some of Flowers for Body Snatchers' dark ambient work. I remember one track where he records himself walking through a forest in Japan, and you can hear the footsteps cracking against the leaves. A poet, in that sense as well, has an element of field recording to their work. You can walk around with a notepad, you can hear a line of dialogue that someone says as they walk past you and write it down, which is a type of field recording. Obviously it's not exactly the same, because unless it is dialogue, most of the other things you record or describe that you see around you is being distorted by putting it into language, and is not as similar as maybe taking a photo, a video, or a sound recording of an atmosphere is. But I think the similarity is there anyway. Part 2. What others say about ambient music and poetry. When I was researching for this video, I was really surprised to see how little there was out there about ambient music and poetry. I mean, ambient music can be everywhere. I mean, one of the seminal or most talked about albums in ambient music history is Music for Airports by Brian Eno. Sometimes it gets called, not his album, just generally, elevator music, and sometimes that can be quite dismissive of a really complex and interesting genre. But there wasn't a lot out there, and I thought it's such a good music to kind of get me into a dreamlike state of consciousness, and it serves to help me write rather than hinder writing. Maybe it's out there en masse, but I only found one article written by a poet where he spoke about it. So hopefully we can stimulate more discussion through this video itself. Ambient music also, I find, comes into my mind and soaks into my body better than some other music does. Other music might give me a affective response of like adrenaline, or I want to dance, or maybe I want to growl or sing along to it or whatever else. But ambient music kind of calms me down, but I feel like it makes my cells resonate in a different way, in kind of what I was discussing in a previous video about poetry and how it affects the body. Although music can affect the body in so many different ways, and different genres will do different things, ambient music is most likely putting your brain into a different wave state. For those of you who don't know, I'm trying to do this off the top of my head, but there's theta waves, delta waves, alpha waves, beta waves, and probably one other. I can't quite remember. And apparently rock music and metal is more likely to get you into a beta wave state, which is more adrenalized and excitable. And then dreams are, I think, sleep is delta wave and dream states are theta wave. I might have that wrong. We'll write it down the right way around. But that's where the state in which more dreams occur means it's a state where more symbols are occurring in your head. And if more symbols are occurring while you're writing, you're more likely going to translate symbols onto the page, and symbols are a fundamental component of poetry. This video is just a start, and I want to continue to explore and have a conversation with ambient artists and poets to find new ways that the two art forms can dialogue and affect and inspire and change how we interpret each other's. And that can go right down from, and this is something I have seen more of, reading poetry over ambient music, or reading poetry within ambient music, or ambient musicians and poets coming together to make shared work, which would then also fly in the face of ambient music doesn't have lyrics, because the poem will kind of become its lyrics. Ambient music frequently charges an atmosphere. Also, we use ambient music a lot in meditation. It's kind of like that vibrations that maybe we hear from sound bowls or something else that kind of do this. They pulse and they emanate and they charge and they change and they work within and without and all the rest. There is a downside that if you are listening to ambient music while you're writing, the ambient music may dominate an emotion that you otherwise aren't necessarily needing to explore at that time. Or if you're reading a poem and there's ambient music playing, like the ambient music may set the scene so well that it can feel like the poem is more profound than it is. But if you stripped the music away and you read the poem on its own, that potentially you're like, okay, this isn't as together or profound as it might have seemed. It can so happen, and this is something I experience usually upon an early draft of something when I'm really in the flow state, and it can feel like, oh, what's coming out is great, and, you know, charged with the music of the atmosphere. It can be like, wow, this is so heavily laden with the exact emotions I'm trying to explore, and everything feels exactly right and what I'm trying to say. And then I come back the next day and I'm like, okay, there's good ideas here, but it's not as profound or interesting or urgent yet as it might have felt in the moment of the draft. So the music that we're listening to can potentially give us a false sense that the work is further along than it is, because we're getting the emotion more from the music than necessarily the poem that we're writing. But what do other poets make of this link? After a poetry workshop with his students, the poet and teacher Eric Baus went out to see Dylan Carson, who's a member of the drone rock/metal band Earth, with a few of his students. After attending, he and his students realized something that, quote, "None of us could quite put into words what happened, but we all seemed to share the impression that being enveloped by a cascade of endlessly radiating waves of sound belonged to the same sensory universe as poetry. Rather than mapping these genres as overlapping entirely, I like to think of poetry and drone music as weird, unwieldy correspondents exerting invisible gravities on one another's orbits." What is this same sensory universe? For me, ambient music is a sound that pulses out of itself. It's continuous expressing. I liken it to when I sit in a meditation one time and I saw a time lapse of a succulent like fractalizing into existence, like turning and twisting and emerging and becoming. And I feel like ambient music really captures this symbolic capacity in our brains and in our unconscious. As I said already, it's very similar to dreams. It's very similar to nostalgia and dreamlikeness and waviness of an ocean, which I find if I'm tapping into those feelings and states, that a poem comes more effortlessly and from a deeper place of myself. But the important thing, and this is one thing that I find helps, especially with my own level of distracted brain, is that listening to ambient music allows me to pay greater attention to things, and allows me, when I'm writing poetry, to pay even more attention to the poem that's happening, because it serves to put me in that state. The poet Donald Revell referred to poetry, and it's also the title of his book, as the art of attention. Paying attention to things, be it in our outer world, through our senses, our sight and smells and sounds, to other people, to our own affective states and the different things happening in our body. The ability to pay attention and then to translate that attention really serves art and poetry. And I think that attentional state is helped for me when I'm listening to ambient music. And I think ambient music, like poetry, encourages that thoughtfulness and that contemplation and that meditation that ambient music is. It's a meditation music, and poetry is a meditative form. We are meditating on something and creating it. Now, as we were saying before, if we're just constantly distracted, the meditation focus isn't there, and there's a fragmentation happening. And within the fragmentation, the strength of a poem might never come through because we're distracted. If you're not paying attention, it's kind of like having a conversation with someone who's telling you something really serious. So maybe their cat got stuck up a tree and they're really distraught, and you're like, oh really? A tree? Or, and a lot more serious things than that. But when you're not paying attention and you're not present, realizations, connections, and all these other things do not occur. The ambient music is probably more similar to the sounds that we hear in nature. If you think about when we're walking around and we want to make field recordings in our notepads, there's tons of sounds happening. If we're walking through a forest, maybe there's a trickling stream, maybe there's bird song, maybe there's, the sound of your own feet walking over a path or over leaves, or crunching against a pine cone, or a pine cone falling out of a tree and hitting against the ground, and a bird hopping over leaves, or whatever else it may be. These sounds they have a structure, but they're not structured together in that other music might structure something together so that it has a specific beat and it has tempo changes at a certain time and whatever else. The sounds in nature are harmonious in one respect, but not harmonious because they're all structured together. And I think ambient music is similar to that. Poems too often lead to striking transformations. It's built into the very nature of the art. While we write, the goal is to come to a transformation or a realization which leads to a transformation, so that the process of writing is a process of finding out. This striking can happen in various moments during the flow state, when we're completely enraptured and attending to the writing of the poem, and there's different moments where you go, that's it, that's it. It's almost like a lightning flash. Here's an example of an illuminating poem by Izumi Shikibu, translated by Jane Hirschfield. Although the wind blows terribly here, the moonlight also leaks between the roof planks of this ruined house. For me, this is an atmospheric poem, which is more akin to what we've been talking about with ambient music. It doesn't directly reference an individual or a speaker, even though there's the chaos of the wind and a raucousness happening. There's also the illumination, which comes in the form of a moon, which is pouring its way or trickling its way through the roof planks into the house. And the fact that it is ruined, gives a sense of pain, like a ruined mind. But that even within pain and ruining, illumination can occur. So that poem, for me, I can see, the chaos of everything is happening here, but when we get those moments of clarity, it's like, well, pouring through that chaos can be, a flowering, an illumination. And this captures ambient music's thoughtfulness and contemplative atmosphere. Hey, thanks for watching part 1 of this 2-part video on poetry and ambient music. If the video is not out already, please check in next week. And if it is, please click the box above to watch part 2. In part 2, we'll talk about repetition, variation, and rhythm in both ambient music and poetry. What do you think? Do you listen to ambient music or write or read poetry, or both, or none of the above? Let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and share with others who either enjoy poetry, ambient music, both, or none at all, and just want to watch something different and relaxing. Thank you to Simon Heath, who's the owner of the record label Crow Chamber, for permission to use music from artists on that label. And thank you to Mount Shrine, the artist behind the song that we used. And rest in peace to Cesar Alexandre, who was the mastermind behind Mount Shrine, who passed away a few years ago. Thanks for watching this video.
Yes, such a good girl.
Why you stop? Thank you.
Yes, such a good girl. It's karma. Mm-hmm.